Alistair MacIntyre, After Virtue, Chapter 6. I think this was a very complicated chapter. I think it was hard to understand. So let me see what I can do to try to walk you through this or give you the main points for some of the more important issues and try to highlight some things. Okay, so utilitarianism. We spoke about this already in class, but utilitarianism was a philosophy that developed in the middle of the 19th century, 1800s. And this was an attempt to create a moral system without God. The goal was to create a world in which you could have the greatest happiness for the greatest number. As I mentioned in class the other day, the way I imagine it is like everyone runs around like a Teletubby with little numbers on their chest on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being super happy and 1 being very miserable. And the idea is you just want to arrange a society almost from a totalitarian managerial manner so that you pull the strings, press the buttons, twist the knobs to basically engineer society with all your enlightenment, big brain power, and figure out how to make most people mostly happy most of the time. And so the idea is that maybe you don't want a world in which there's like 1% who are 10s and 99% who are 1s. Maybe you just have to level it all out so that maybe most people are between 6 and 7 most of the time. All right, so that's the goal. You want to manage the world so that you try to get most people mostly happy most of the time. And it failed. It failed as a philosophy and a system. Why? Well, there are actually many reasons. There are many reasons why it failed. And let me just go over a couple of them. Like, how do you measure happiness or pleasure on some objective scale, as if we can assign everyone like a Teletubby number on their chest and know how happy they are most of the time? Because happiness, they realize, is very complicated. It's a very simplistic way of looking at things, what they're trying to do. Well, imagine living in a small trailer. Yeah, that's good. You got shelter. But living in a massive luxury mansion that's brand new and awesome, well, that's better. Okay, so there's a way you can scale the happiness and rank the happiness on an objective comparative level of living in a trailer and having your basic needs met versus living in Versailles. Okay, that's a way to compare that. Okay, how about eating a hamburger from McDonald's? Well, that's good. Okay, eating a lavish meal at a 3-star Michelin restaurant. Well, that's a lot better. Okay, so you can scale those numbers up, 1's a 1, a 1's a 9, or a 10. Okay, so we can imagine trying to scale those things out so people live in housing that's something in between Versailles and a trailer park. You get that from most people. In between McDonald's hamburger and a 3-star Michelin restaurant. Okay, get that even for most people. Make that pretty good for most people. Okay, so you can imagine doing something like that. But how do you compare the more complicated life experiences? Falling in love, what number do you give that? Reading a great novel. Okay, how do you put numbers on that? Beholding the Grand Canyon or feeling euphoria when you climb Mount Everest. How do you compare something like having a Diet Coke and swimming across the most beautiful lake in Colorado? How do you compare that kind of happiness? The whole project of assigning numerical value to personal happiness just becomes absurd as you start going to the nitty-gritty of life and trying to compare things like that. And also seeking my individual happiness and pleasure often clashes with seeking the common happiness and pleasure of the entire community. The two things are irreconcilable. For example, I might seek my own happiness, and that will come at the expense of the people around me. Or I may seek the happiness of the people around me, but that actually might make me miserable. All right, so he wants the greatest personal happiness for the greatest number. These things are not the same thing. They often are irreconcilable. They clash. And so the whole project collapses. The chapter then goes on to talk about the idea of rights. He brings up a philosopher called G. Worth. And G. Worth, again, is a more modern philosopher, and he tries to come up with a way to, again, build a moral system using the idea of rights, by the way, build a moral system that is without God, without revelation, without supernatural recourse, but actually build a rational moral system. Okay, so there are 3 ideas in G. Worth's idea that MacIntyre brings up. Number 1, all people are rational agents. All right, we're all rational. That is what it means to be human. Okay, true, fair enough. Number 2, all rational agents, which are all people, must have some minimum amount of freedom and well-being to function as rational agents. All right, fair enough. I mean, I am by nature a rational agent. That's a hypothesis that you could actually prove. But in order for me to function as a rational agent, I have to have some freedom and some stuff in my life, some food and shelter to function as I was intended to as a rational agent. Okay, also true, fair enough. Step 3 is where things break down. This is where things get complicated. Since I'm a rational agent and I recognize you as a rational agent, you have a right to some amount of freedom and well-being to function as a rational agent. And I have the same right to the same amount of freedom and well-being to function as a rational agent, because that is basically what we are in our essence. We're rational agents, and we need to have some amount of freedom and well-being to function as a rational agent. Okay, well, actually, the third step is where MacIntyre says this gets really interesting. It may be true that I'm a rational agent. It may be true that I have a minimum level, I need a minimum level of freedom and well-being to function as a rational agent. But need and want is not the same thing as having a right to something. And MacIntyre makes this very funny and interesting statement that rights are fictions, just as unicorns and witches are fictions. All right? Unicorns are nice. I wish they were real. My daughter believes in unicorns. But being nice and actually believing in it and wanting it to be true does not actually make unicorns real. The same can be said of rights, human rights. We can imagine them. We can imagine they're real. We can activist they're real. It doesn't actually make it real. They are fictions. It's a nice fiction, but it's actually a fiction. We invented them. The concept of rights or human rights are socially constructed. We as a society have invented the idea of rights. It doesn't make it real. It makes it functionally real in utilitarian or pragmatic sense, but it's not like some ontological reality the way God is. But we act like it's just something that's absolutely true, like the law of gravity. It's just real. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but there's actually no proof for it. In fact, he makes a point that the concept didn't even exist until very recently. In other languages, historically, and in other cultures, the word or the idea of rights as a word does not even exist. There are things that are analogous to rights or like rights, but not in the fully fleshed out way that we think of that rights exist. The word doesn't exist. That means the idea did not exist in the minds of other societies until very recently. So how can you make the claim that these rights are universal, that they're transcendently true, the way numbers are true, the way gravity is true, the way stars are true, the way physics is true? That's what we're looking for, right? We're looking for these universal, transcendent moral laws that bind all people at all times, at all places. That's the goal, right? And the idea of rights is supposed to be some substitute for morality or a part of that morality. And yet to say it's a real binding mandate on people, it's kind of sketchy when you say it doesn't really exist until recently, and you can't even prove that they're real. It's wishful thinking. And furthermore, this is my own thoughts on the matter, rights keep expanding. If they are so real and true, then why is the idea of rights so fluid all the time? Why does it keep expanding? More things. I mean, what are human rights anyway? Well, our documents in America list rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, we think of those as human rights that are unalienable from who we are. I mean, it's a basic part of what it means to be human. Our documents say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Actually, they got that idea from John Locke. John Locke said life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Except property sounded a little bit too gauche and gross for the founding fathers, so they changed it to happiness. But happiness really is sort of a stand-in for property. Is property a human right? Is being human means that like you cannot alienate that from me? You cannot. I must have the right to own things. Interesting. Karl Marx doesn't think so. But anyway, are these basic human rights? Okay, well, let's grant that. Life, liberty, property, and happiness. Fine, why not? Let's just say that they are human rights. Well, why? Why? Because they are self-evidently true? We hold these truths to be self-evident. What on earth does that mean? It just means I know because I know. We all know, right? We just know, right? I don't know. That's kind of a weird philosophical claim. It's self-evidently true. How about intuitions? Do we know these rights by intuitions? I love the point that McIntyre makes, that when philosophers resort to intuitions as a form of proof, clearly that is an indication that something has gone terribly wrong. I mean, I think the same can be said for any resort to self-evident to make a point, to make a proof, to make a claim. Both are, I think, in my mind, the intellectual equivalent of having an argument. And you know you're about to lose. You're running out of arguments. You're about to lose. And then you sort of say in a tantrum, well, it's true because I just say so, end of argument. It's just true. It's true. Stop it. So when someone says it's true by intuition or self-evident, it's kind of like just saying, I said it's true. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Yeah. So it's a pretty specious claim to say we have rights. I mean, it's art to claim. How do you prove logically that we have rights, that they're a real thing? Also, they keep expanding, as I said before. Lately in the political discussions that we've been having in our nation, I hear that healthcare is now a human right now. I don't remember having that discussion. So now, or as Americans, you know, as human beings, transcendent rights that are just universally human being rights: life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, and healthcare. Healthcare is human right now. Okay. I also hear lately that some people are saying that universal basic income is human right now. I should just get $20,000 from the government every year. That's a human right? I don't know. I hear that free college tuition is a universal human right now, according to some. Oh yeah, affordable housing is a universal human right. Look, I'm not making fun of healthcare, universal basic income, or free college tuition, affordable housing. Pragmatically, prudentially, maybe it could be argued that we ought to just give this to all Americans. But to claim that it's a ontological, transcendent, cosmological human right, the way math and gravity are true, I think you're gonna have to I don't know how you prove that, all right? And yet it seems like every couple of years we get more rights. Rights keep getting stacked on under the umbrella of universal basic human rights. Recently, someone claimed that government-funded late-term abortion on demand is a universal human right. I suppose for the mother, maybe, not for the baby. Anyway, so we keep getting new human rights now, right? Based on what? Self-evident truths? Intuitions? I mean, how do you dispute such a claim? What is that based on? And this is what McIntyre is pointing out. We seem to have this religious faith that there are these things called human rights. But we can't really argue about it. There's no rational way to discuss this in a way to hold any water. He then goes on to make the claim, McIntyre goes on to make the claim in the chapter, that rights often clash with utility, utilitarianism, right? This often happens. Individual rights clash with utility. Another word for utility could be my happiness, okay? My happiness may entail stomping on your rights. Your rights invade my happiness. This often happens. So for example, let's just say you want free college tuition, free healthcare, and affordable housing because it's your human, universal, basic human right. Fine. Okay, but to get that, the government's gonna have to tax me a lot. And that takes away my property and my utility, or my pursuit of my own happiness. McIntyre then goes on to observe that protests often involve crowds of people chanting and screaming, and they all agree with one another. They often protest, you know, they're often very moral. They're making moral claims. There's often a sense of, I like it when he brings up that protests often have an air of moral indignation. You're angry. How dare you? How dare you? You know, they're very moral. But, you know, and they can't, the thing about more protests is that you can't argue with the other side. You make moral claims and we all agree with one another. We're chanting, but we don't agree with, and no one else, we all agree with one another, but nothing we do will convince someone else. And there's counter protests across the streets. They're chanting the opposite and they are morally indignant, right? And they can't convince me. We are at these moments of just can't argue with one another. McIntyre then goes on to argue or to write about three categories of characters that characterize our modern age, who traffic in the moral fictions and delusions of our age: the aesthete, their therapist, and the manager. He doesn't say much about the aesthete. The aesthete is a person who just indulges in art and pleasure, the Werther fellow. And there's not much more to say about it other than that, morality has appeared as the pursuit of one's own passion, desires. That's a moral fiction of the age we live in. The therapist, I mentioned this in the other lecture, but the therapist has replaced the priest. You're a psychologist, you're a therapist, you're a psychiatrist. By the way, my dad was a psychiatrist. I don't really hate these people, but nonetheless, I think he makes a point that the therapist has replaced a priest. He helps you with your soul. The therapist has taken a sort of moral authority in our society. Now, the problem is that if you go to a therapist, they're going to claim to be morally neutral. They're not going to claim to be priests. They'll just claim to be like medical doctors who are just here to help you with your problems. And usually, there are various different kinds of schools of therapy, but usually when you go to a therapist, in the first meeting or so, you sort of make a contract with them, where the therapist will say, okay, I'm not your friend necessarily. I'm here to help you with a specific problem. What problem do you have? You may have 100 problems, and we're here to deal with a particular set of problems, like 1, 2, or maybe three problems. Say, tell me what you want me to fix about you, right? And we're going to limit our therapy just to those issues. And we can expand them later on, but we have to be explicit about that. So they're claiming to be morally neutral, and you make a contract with them. All right. Except the fact of the matter is, even though they claim to be morally neutral, they have taken on this role of like this soul doctor, this priest who's going to help you become a better person. And yet what it means to be a better person, that's rather unclear. I mean, they might say something like, we're here to help you become better adjusted. Adjusted to what? In other words, here's a world, here's you, you're maladjusted, you're not fitting in. We're just help you fit into the world better. It's not clear that it's like they've entered this quasi-moral priest-like phase where they're kind of moral, but it's unclear what the moral foundation of what the therapist is. They're just here to help you get along in the world. Well, what does that mean, though? Who's to determine that? That's one of these unexamined moral assumptions that our age has taken on. Again, I mean, his whole claim is that like we have like it's like the moral universe has been shattered, like a cathedral has been knocked down by a meteorite, and around us we have little shards of stained glass, little stones here, little bits of the altar. Broken bits are recognizably part of an older moral order, but not in any way that coherently fits together, just little incoherent pieces of things. And I think therapy is an example of those things where it's got some element of morality, but not in any way that makes any coherent sense. He also makes a point that the schools of therapy, there are many, many competing schools of therapy, and they make a point of trashing one another, saying that, we're right, they're wrong, we're right, they're wrong. And they do a pretty good job of trashing one another. And yet you think that if you trash one another, they would annihilate one another's validity. But they don't. We still act like they're right. We still act like they know what they're doing. And in many ways, it's very risky. You're giving yourself over to a therapist. You're really trusting them to know what they're doing with your being and yet your mind. Except, we don't really question them. We don't even question what that telos is. We just give ourselves over to them. I find that very interesting. He really spends a lot of time trashing the managerial class. And I talk about this in my other lecture where I talk about how he just absolutely trashes the social sciences. So this sort of part of the managerial class does flow into that other thing. But by managerial class, he means people with MBAs, CEOs, presidents of banks, corporations. People who are MBAs, CEOs, they claim to be morally neutral. But he wants to make the claim that they're not morally neutral. They just claim to be morally neutral. They claim that their expertise is to be efficient. They're here to streamline work paths of efficiency. Now, he wants to make the claim that, CEOs and banks and corporations, they could very effectively, efficiently trash the earth by polluting things to death, right? They could destroy the planet. They can put hundreds of people in poverty, thousands or millions of people living in like squalors of pollution. They could very efficiently make tons of money for their shareholders, their employees, but they could destroy societies in the process. I mean, not to get too much into the details about this, but some time ago, I'm not sure if you remember this, but there was a banking mortgage crisis starting in 2008 as a dramatic example. These managers, these bankers were locked in like the gilded iron cage described by Weber, right? They were They were operating under their own incentive structures, and they ended up making an insane amount of money for a short amount of time, but they almost trashed the entire planet's economic system. But they were very efficient for what they were doing. All right, so they're efficient, but they're efficiently immoral, perhaps. And this is what we have in the modern world: morality or pseudo morality without Christianity, fragments of morality without any ontological, teleological structure holding together. And it's a sorry state of things. All right, on that note, I'll leave this one. Okay, bye.